Her family disowned the heiress for loving an old miner. The shocking secret was why. Blackwood, Pennsylvania. A coal town defined by its jagged mountains, its roads dusted with black soot, and the steady shriek of the mine whistle signaling the change of shifts. It was a place that forged resilient, hard-working people in its gritty image, and rising above this industrial city was its wealthiest family. The Hayes clan, owners of a massive coal enterprise, their fortune a thing of local legend. The family had long lived in the lap of luxury, bound by strict rules of honor and social status. In their opulent villa on the Grand Road leading out of town, lived Grace Hayes, the youngest daughter of the patriarch, Preston Hayes. Grace had just turned 22. She possessed a gentle, pure beauty, part refined heiress, part innocent youth. Having graduated with honors, she was preparing to study abroad to eventually take her place in the family empire. The entire clan expected her to be their pride, to marry a man of equal wealth and status, further elevating the family's prestige. But life is seldom so predictable. The young woman's heart did not flutter for the charming young men at lavish parties, nor for the educated sons of other prominent families. Instead, it was stirred by a man who seemed utterly ordinary, a man from a world completely opposite her own. He was a 65-year-old coal miner named Frank. Frank was a veteran miner, having spent more than 40 years of his life in the deep, dark shafts. His face was etched with hardship, his hair silvered by dust and time. His hands were calloused from decades of labor. He lived a quiet life in a modest, old company apartment block. His wife had passed away long ago, and his only son had left town years ago without a word. His life revolved around his work at the mine and a few old friends in the same boat. In everyone's eyes, Frank was a man on the far side of life's mountain, with nothing left to offer a young woman's interest, let alone her love. But cruel fate had arranged an unexpected meeting. One afternoon during a heavy downpour, as Grace was driving her convertible on the road leading to the mines, her car suddenly skidded into a muddy ditch. Just as she was in danger, Frank happened to be walking by. Without a moment's hesitation, he rushed to help. He not only pulled her car from the mire but also shielded her from the lashing, ice-cold rain. In that moment, amidst the bleak landscape, Grace saw not an old, worn-out miner, but a warm, honorable, and capable man. From that second on, her life began to turn in a different direction. Gratitude slowly turned into curiosity, then admiration, and finally, a deep affection. In Frank, Grace found an emotional anchor, a sincerity that was rare in the calculated world she knew. And as she quietly followed the call of her heart, an seemingly impossible love affair began to form. The love affair between a young, wealthy heiress and a 65-year-old coal miner. When the story began to surface, Grace's entire family was stunned, viewing it as a disgrace. The town gossiped, friends whispered, and many sneered. But Grace did not back down. She believed her love had a reason to exist, and that the truth behind it was far greater than anyone could imagine. Grace was born into the wealthiest family in Blackwood. Her father, Preston Hayes, was a coal magnate. He had started with nothing, but through grit and opportunity, he quickly built a colossal fortune. From the day he became a mine owner, the Hayes family entered the ranks of the powerful elite. His voice carried significant weight in both the business world and local politics. Grace was the youngest of 3 siblings. Her 2 older brothers were sent to study abroad early on and had both returned to help their father manage the company. As the only daughter, Grace was thoroughly spoiled by her parents, treated as the jewel of the family. From a young age, she lived in luxury, attended the best schools, and socialized with her peers. Outsiders could only look on in envy. That young lady is destined for a brilliant future, a marriage to an equal that will only enhance the family's legacy. At 22, Grace was in the prime of her youth. She was exquisitely beautiful, with a bright face and a gentle smile. Many wealthy young men from the region, and even from major cities like Pittsburgh, sought introductions. In their eyes, she was not just a beautiful young woman, but the golden girl of a powerful dynasty. Marrying Grace was a ticket to the top, a perfect union of love and profit. But Grace cared little for their flashy overtures. She was naturally quiet, preferring simplicity and solitude. Instead of lavish parties, she loved to read books in the library or walk along the river that cut through Blackwood, where the water flowed endlessly and the air carried the crisp mountain scent. Deep in her heart was a desire to live true to her own feelings, to not be bound by her family's calculations. This often worried her parents, Preston would frequently advise her. You must understand who you are. You cannot afford to love carelessly. And you certainly cannot let personal feelings damage the honor of this entire family. Grace would only remain silent and nod obediently. But a seed of doubt was planted in her heart. Was true love, she wondered, really just an arrangement of money and status? In everyone's eyes, Grace was a source of pride. She was a brilliant student, well-mannered, and always maintained a pristine image. But no one knew that behind that facade was a heart that yearned for a genuine love. At that time, Grace had no idea that destiny had arranged a fateful meeting for her. The man who would completely change her view on love was not a handsome, dashing youth, but a 65-year-old miner named Frank. His arrival in her life would be like a strange wind, blowing away all the rules and giving her the courage to cross the boundaries her family had so carefully constructed. Chuk Chun Roy, de la Fundi Chodoan Tiep Theo Kwakau Chuayan. One early summer afternoon, the sky over Blackwood suddenly opened up in a downpour. Heavy raindrops pelted the coal-dusted pavement, making the road to the mine slick and treacherous. Grace's luxury car sped through the curtain of rain, its wipers working frantically, but the sudden storm had turned a section of the road into a sheet of grease. The wheels suddenly lost their grip, and the entire car was sucked into a muddy ditch on the side of the road. The engine whined weakly. Grace panicked, her heart pounding. She fumbled for her phone, but the signal was spotty due to the heavy rain. Just then, a hunched figure appeared in the distance. It was Frank, the miner, just off his shift. He wore a worn-out plastic raincoat, his boots caked in mud. Seeing the situation, he didn't hesitate for a second, striding quickly toward her, ignoring the rain that lashed his face. "Don't you worry, miss." Frank's raspy voice boomed over the downpour. In a flash, he was in the ditch, his calloused hands strained to push the trapped wheel. Mud splattered all over him, but his eyes were filled with determination. Grace nervously opened her door, but he quickly stopped her. "Stay in the car. I'll handle this." After a few minutes of struggle, the car was finally freed from the mud. Frank was panting, sweat mixing with the rain on his weathered face. Grace rushed out, her high heels sinking into the mud, her eyes wide as she looked at the man before her. In that moment, she realized he was more than just an ordinary old miner. "Sir, thank you so much," Grace said, bowing her head respectfully. Frank just smiled kindly and shook his head. "It's nothing, just a small thing. Someone's always having trouble out here at the mine. You get home safe now. This road is dangerous." With that, he turned to leave, his posture as quiet and unassuming as if what he had just done was nothing at all. But Grace stood frozen, her eyes following his figure as it disappeared into the rain. That night, back at the villa, she couldn't sleep. The image of the miner, his hands covered in mud but his eyes shining brightly, was seared into her mind. She wondered who he was, what his life was like, and how he could so calmly help a complete stranger in the middle of such a fierce storm. From that day on, the image of Frank was vivid in Grace's mind. Whenever she drove past the mine, she would unconsciously scan the area for the old miner in his faded work clothes. Grace was used to a world of luxury, where compliments were often tied to self-interest, but in Frank, she saw someone completely different. He had helped her in a moment of crisis with no expectation of reward. One weekend afternoon, Grace drove into the miner's housing complex. She spotted Frank sitting on his porch, skillfully mending a pair of old rubber boots. She boldly approached him. "Do you remember me, sir?" Frank looked up, his kind eyes showing a flicker of surprise before breaking into a smile. "Ah, the young lady from the other day. Is the car all right now?" Grace nodded and offered him a small gift bag, containing an expensive box of ginseng. But Frank quickly waved it away, his voice firm. "You keep that. I don't need it. Helping someone in trouble is just the right thing to do, not something you do for a reward." His simple words stunned her. From then on, Grace began to learn more about his life. She heard from an old woman who sold drinks at the edge of the complex that Frank had once had a happy family, but his wife had died young from a sudden illness. His only son, ashamed of their poverty, had left to find work elsewhere and had lost contact years ago. Frank had shouldered a lifetime of hardship alone. Grace listened, a complex emotion welling up inside her. She began to feel a deep sense of pity and respect for him. Her gratitude slowly blossomed into admiration. She no longer saw Frank as just a rescuer, but as a man worthy of her deepest esteem. And that admiration was quietly planting the seeds of a deeper feeling, a feeling Grace herself did not yet dare to name. Ever since learning about Frank's life of loss, Grace felt she could no longer remain indifferent. At first, she thought of him simply as her rescuer, someone she should visit and chat with to ease his loneliness. But gradually, her visits were no longer about gratitude. They became a need stemming from her own heart. Every week, Grace would find an excuse to go to the housing complex, sometimes with a basket of fruit, other times with some medicinal supplements, and sometimes with just a few old books. At first, Frank would refuse, saying he was used to a hard life and didn't need anything. But seeing the sincerity in Grace's eyes, he would eventually nod, a mix of shyness and emotion on his face. On some afternoons, Grace would sit with him on his porch, listening to him tell stories about his years in the mines. His voice was raspy, his calloused hands gesturing as he described the deep, dark shafts where the darkness was absolute, guided only by the small beam of a headlamp. Grace listened intently. In her eyes, he was no longer just an old miner, but a silent warrior, a courageous man who had weathered countless storms in his life. Once, Grace brought a meal she had cooked herself. She shyly placed the simple tray on the old wooden table and smiled. "Try this and see if my cooking is any good." Frank was moved to silence. It had been so many years since Head had a proper family meal. Since his wife's death and his son's departure, his meals had been solitary, simple affairs. For the first time in all those years, he felt the warmth of human connection, the taste of home. Day by day, their bond grew stronger. Grace realized she looked forward to her afternoon visits, to hearing his laugh, to seeing the kindness in his experienced eyes. She began to make comparisons. She thought of the young, flashy men who had pursued her, with their empty compliments, none of whom had ever made her feel as safe as Frank did. They lacked the sincerity that had moved her so deeply. Her heart began to flutter, but her mind tried to reason with her. No, this is just respect, just pity. But emotions are a difficult thing to hide. Grace's visits to the miners' complex could not remain a secret forever. At first, she cleverly lied, saying she was going for a walk by the river or visiting a friend, but her absence from family dinners began to arouse her parents' suspicion. Preston Hayes was a meticulous man who always observed his daughter's every move, and he noticed the strange changes in her. One evening, as Grace returned home, her mother, Helen, stopped her at the door, her voice laced with suspicion. "Where have you been to get so dirty?" Grace was flustered, stammering. I was visiting a friend who lives near the coal mine." Preston stepped out from the living room, his sharp eyes fixed on his daughter. He said nothing more, only nodded to his personal driver. The next day, he had her followed. After just a few visits, the truth was revealed. That evening, the atmosphere in the villa was suffocatingly tense. Preston called Grace down to the living room, where the entire family was gathered, their expressions grim. He slapped a folder of photographs taken by the driver onto the table, his voice low. "Explain this." Grace looked at the photos of her chatting with Frank, of her carrying a tray of food into his small apartment, and her heart sank. She knew this moment would come sooner or later. "Father," she said, taking a deep breath to steady her voice, "I know Mr. Frank has a very good man. I just have a great deal of respect for him." Before she could finish, Preston slammed his hand on the table. "Respect? Do you have any idea who he is? An old, worn-out, poor miner. And you are my daughter. Your future is to marry a worthy man of education and status. What you are doing is disgracing the honor of this entire family. Chak Chun Roy, de la Fundich Chodoan Tiep Theo Kukau Chuyen." Helen also burst into tears, grabbing her daughter's hand and pleading, "Grace, you're young. You don't understand the world. That man is more than 40 years older than you. Whatever love you think you feel, it's just pity. Listen to your mother, stop this now." Grace's eldest brother, Thomas, also spoke up, his voice sharp. "Do you have any idea what people will say? A Hayes heiress in love with a poor old miner. Have you thought about our family's reputation?" Grace lifted her head, her eyes shining with resolve. "I know everyone will object. But to me, Frank is more than just a poor miner. He's a man with a kind heart, with a strength and integrity that I deeply admire. I can't pretend I don't have these feelings." The room exploded. Preston roared in anger. "From tomorrow, you are forbidden from setting foot in that housing complex again. If you insist on being stubborn, I'll have every road and path blocked. I will not allow my daughter to destroy this family's name. Grace took a step back, tears welling in her eyes, but her heart felt more resolute than ever. She knew this was only the beginning of a great storm. But if she had to choose between pleasing her family and being true to her heart, she would choose the second path, no matter how thorny it might be. After that tense evening, the Hayes family thought Grace would reconsider and obediently give up, but they were wrong. In the following days, Grace secretly found ways to contact Frank. She knew her father had people watching her, even controlling her schedule. But a heart cannot be locked away. The more they tried to stop her, the more she realized that her feelings were real. One morning at breakfast, Preston tried to remain calm, speaking in a measured tone. Grace, I've arranged for you to meet the son of a close friend. Has currently a branch director for a bank in New York City, here on business. Give him a chance, and you'll understand what kind of man is truly worthy of you. Grace put down her utensils and replied calmly, Father, I know you want what's best for me, but my heart can't follow an arrangement. The man I've chosen is not a bank director or some wealthy heir. It's Frank. Her words were like a thunderclap during the meal. Preston's face went pale, and Helen burst into tears. Her eldest brother slammed his chopsticks on the table, snarling, Are you insane? A minor older than your own father, and you call that love? Grace looked directly at her brother, her voice steady. I'm not insane. I know exactly what I'm doing. To me, Frank is a sincere, decent man. You can laugh, but I feel happy when I'm with him. The family erupted. Preston shot to his feet, slamming his hand on the table. If you persist, then from this day forward, you are no longer my daughter. The declaration was like a knife to Grace's heart, but she didn't shed a single tear. She knew her father was acting out of anger for his honor, but deep down, she also knew she could not turn back. That evening, Grace quietly left the villa and drove to the housing complex to find Frank. Seeing her weary expression, he asked anxiously, Did you argue with your family again? Grace sat down, her eyes red but her voice firm. They'll never accept it, but I can't give up. I just want to be with you. Frank was speechless, his heart aching. He knew that if this relationship continued, Grace would have to endure immense pressure. He gently stroked her hair, his voice raspy. Grace, I'm an old man. I'm not worthy of you. You have a whole future, a whole life ahead of you. Don't make yourself miserable for my sake. Grace looked up, her eyes shining with determination. No. Don't say that. I've thought about this a lot. You are the person I truly cherish. You can reject me, but my heart has already chosen. Frank fell silent, a fierce conflict raging within him. On one side was his dignity, his reason telling him to stay away from her. On the other was the sincere love from the young woman sitting before him. Meanwhile, at the villa, the Hayes family continued to strategize. Grace's brothers insisted they had to stop her by any means necessary, even considering sending her to study abroad immediately to separate her from the old miner. But just when they thought they had the situation under control, Grace became more determined than ever. She wasn't afraid of the prying eyes or the malicious gossip. The only thing she feared was losing a true love, the only love that had ever made her heart tremble. After the rainy night when Frank had tried to reject her, Grace had cried until she had no tears left. But as the sun rose, a new resolve dawned in her heart. If Frank was pushing her away out of dignity, then she would be the one to stand up, to face everyone, to make her feelings public so there was nothing left to hide. The next day, Grace drove straight to the mine. It was the morning shift. Workers filed in, and the work whistle blew under a gray, overcast sky. They were surprised to see the elegant, wealthy heiress appear at the company bus stop, her small frame radiating an unusual determination. Grace stepped out of her car, her white shoes immediately sinking into the mud, but she didn't care. Her eyes scanned the crowd for Frank, and then she saw him. A thin figure in a faded blue uniform, carrying his familiar miner's lamp on his shoulder. Without hesitation, in front of dozens of workers, Grace ran to him and called out clearly, Frank! Frank froze, stunned to see her there. He was flustered, his voice sharp. Grace, go home, now. This is not the place for you. But she shook her head, her eyes tearful but resolute. No, I'm not leaving. I came here to make things clear. In front of everyone. I love you. The entire area fell silent. The workers looked at each other, in utter disbelief. A beautiful, rich heiress, standing in a place full of coal dust. confessing her love to a 65-year-old miner. Frank was horrified and tried to pull her away. But she resisted, her voice ringing out even stronger. You can all laugh, you can all gossip, but I don't care. My heart has chosen him. Even if my family objects, even if the world scoffs, I still want to be by his side. A murmur went through the crowd. A few of the older workers looked at Frank with sympathy. Others whispered amongst themselves. But no one could deny the sincerity in Grace's every word. Frank stood motionless, his heart feeling like it would burst. He had never dreamed that one day a young woman would be willing to sacrifice her own honor to publicly declare her love for him. Frank. Grace smiled. A smile wet with tears but full of courage. I'm not afraid of being hurt. The only thing I'm afraid of is losing you. Her words left him speechless. The scene quickly became a hot topic of conversation. The next day, in every neighborhood, in every cafe, people were talking about how the heiress Grace Hayes had publicly professed her love for the old miner, right at the coal pit. As for the Hayes family, when they heard the news, they were pushed to the absolute brink of fury. Preston felt his honor had been openly challenged. In his mind, this was no longer his daughter's private affair. It was a direct war on the reputation of the entire clan. After Grace's public declaration at the mine, the Hayes family erupted in an emergency meeting. That evening, the villa's living room was brightly lit. Preston sat in the main chair, his face red with rage. Beside him, Helen sobbed and lamented, while Grace's brothers vehemently condemned her actions. After a tense discussion, Preston made a decision. He would use any means necessary to force Frank to give up, including money. In his world, there was nothing that couldn't be bought. The next day, a luxury car pulled up in front of the housing complex. Two men in immaculate suits stepped out, carrying a leather briefcase. They knocked on Frank's door, sending a wave of commotion through the entire neighborhood. Chak Chun Ro. De la Fundich Cho Doan Tiep Theo. One of the men opened the briefcase, placing a thick stack of cash on the table. His voice was cold. Mr. Frank, surely you know what kind of trouble you're causing. Miss Grace is the only daughter of the Hayes family. A relationship between you and her is unacceptable. Take this money and leave Blackwood. If you need, we can arrange a new job for you somewhere else. Frank was silent. He understood this wasn't an offer. It was a veiled command. And if I don't agree? He asked, his voice low and raspy. The other man raised an eyebrow and smirked. Then you'll have to face the consequences. An old miner like you is no match for a powerful clan. Think of Miss Grace. It would be best for you to back away. They left the briefcase and departed, their arrogance palpable. The small room fell into silence. Frank sat down, his trembling hand reaching for the stack of money, but he immediately snapped the briefcase shut. A deep sadness mixed with indignation flashed in his eyes. Is a man's entire life of dignity worth only a few stacks of cash? He thought. But his heart ached with conflict. They were right. He couldn't fight an entire powerful family, and if he persisted, Grace would be the one to suffer. That evening, Grace came to see him. The moment she saw the briefcase on the table, she knew what had happened. Her face went pale, then her eyes blazed with fury. They came, didn't they? They tried to force you to leave. Frank lowered his head, his voice heavy. Grace, maybe you should listen to your family. I'm an old man. I don't want you to be hurt because of me. Grace rushed forward and clasped his hand, her eyes filled with tears but fiercely determined. No, I won't let them tear us apart. Don't you leave. I will be the one to face them all. Frank looked at her, his heart feeling as if it were being torn in two. On one side was the love burning in his old heart. On the other, the fear that he would bring harm to the girl he cherished. But in that moment, he also understood that Grace was not a weak girl. She was ready to fight for this love, and he couldn't keep running away anymore. After the Hayes family sent their men with the money, Grace became even more determined not to abandon Frank. But in the following days, the storm raged on. Her family tightened their control, even restricting her freedom to leave the house. Still, she found ways to see him. She believed that if her heart was pure, the truth would eventually speak for itself. And then, on one fateful night, that truth began to emerge. Preston Hayes was drinking with a few old friends from the mining industry. They were men who had toiled in the shafts years ago, back when Preston didn't have the empire he had now. In a drunken haze, one of them mentioned Frank's name. Hey, Preston, you remember Frank the miner? The one who saved your life all those years ago. Preston froze, the glass in his hand stopping mid-air. The image of the past rushed back, a time when he was just a young, poor worker on the night shift. A mine tunnel had collapsed. Rocks fell, the air thick with coal dust. He had thought his life was over. But in that moment, a co-worker had rushed in, risking his own life to pull him from the rubble. That man was Frank. Frank had been seriously injured in the shoulder that day, an injury that would affect him for the rest of his life. But Preston had escaped death. Soon after, a business opportunity arose, and he slowly clawed his way to wealth. In the whirlwind of success, he had all but forgotten the man who had saved him, remembering him only occasionally with a flicker of guilt. Hearing his friend's words, Preston felt a chill run down his spine. He muttered, "Frank. That was him?" At that exact moment, Grace was standing in the hallway and overheard the entire conversation. Her heart trembled, and tears streamed down her face. So Frank wasn't just her love. He was the man who had saved her father's life. The truth was shocking, but it was also a powerful testament that her feelings were not meaningless. The very next day, Grace went to Frank's small apartment and threw her arms around him, sobbing as she spoke. "Frank, I know, years ago, you saved my father in the mine collapse. If it weren't for you, my family wouldn't be where it is today." Frank was taken aback. Then he slowly nodded, his voice a low rasp. "Yes, that's true. But that was a long time ago. I never wanted to bring it up." Grace shook her head, her eyes shining with pride. "No. You're my father's hero. You're our family's savior. How could they forget that and treat you so unjustly?" That evening, when his daughter confronted him, Preston could no longer deny it. He was silent for a long time, a flicker of shame in his eyes. The memory of the past was vivid, Frank's calloused hands pulling him from the jaws of death, but out of pride, out of fear of losing face, Preston kept his voice cold. "Regardless, gratitude is one thing, but your marriage is another. I cannot let my daughter enter into such an improper relationship." Grace's heart ached at his words, but she knew the truth was slowly coming to light. Sooner or later, her entire family would have to face the debt they owed to the past. After Grace mentioned the old debt, her mother, Helen, was stunned into silence. That evening, she sat by her bedroom window for a long time, staring out at the quiet, sprawling grounds. Memories she thought had been dormant for more than 20 years came flooding back, so clearly it made her heart ache. Back then, she wasn't the elegant lady she was now. She was just an ordinary woman, struggling through poverty with her husband, Preston. She remembered that fateful day as if it were yesterday. When she heard the mine had collapsed, she had cried until she fainted, believing she had lost her husband forever. If it hadn't been for Frank, she would have been a widow, and her children would have grown up without a father. Now, seeing her own daughter fall in love with Frank, she understood. It wasn't a cruel irony, it was fate. Grace's love, as unconventional as it was the very thing pulling their family back toward morality, toward gratitude, toward honoring what truly mattered. That night, Helen went to her husband's study. Preston was looking over some documents, his face tense. She sat down and spoke slowly. "Do you remember all those years ago? If it weren't for Frank, would you even be sitting here today? We have wealth, we have power, but we owe that man a life. Are you going to deny it forever?" Preston froze. Helen looked at her husband, her voice choked with emotion. "To say otherwise is to betray heaven itself. That man has lived a hard life but has never lost his character. If Grace finds happiness with him, I would rather she follow her heart than be forced to live a lifetime of tears." Her words left Preston speechless. In his heart, the word savior was like a knife, twisting deep in his conscience. Grace happened to overhear their conversation, and a wave of emotion washed over her. She knew that, at the very least, her mother was beginning to understand. It was a sign that the walls of the clan were beginning to crack. After Helen reminded them of the debt from the past, many in the Hayes clan began to waver. But not everyone was ready to accept the truth. In the extended family, beyond Grace's parents and brothers, there were aunts and uncles who always had an eye on the family's vast fortune. For them, Grace's marriage wasn't just about love. It was about inheritance and future profits. De la fundich chohoi ket kukotrian. At a family meeting, Harrison, Preston's younger brother, spoke up, his voice sharp. "Don't you forget that Grace is the youngest, she has a stake in the company. If she marries a poor miner, won't our assets be diluted? We cannot let that happen." And so, the vicious rumors began. At first, they were just whispers. I heard that old miner Frank is only after Grace for her money. Then, the story was embellished. Hez drowning in debt and using her to escape poverty. The rumors spread like wildfire. Within days, all of Blackwood was talking. People would point whenever Grace and Frank appeared together, their stares no longer curious, but filled with scorn. Grace was in agony, but her faith in him remained unshaken. She found Frank and held his hand tightly. Frank, don't pay any attention to their lies. I believe in you. I know what kind of man you are. Frank was silent, a quiet fury churning inside him. He had lived his entire life with integrity, never harming a soul. And now, simply because of his and Grace's feelings, people dared to invent stories to slander him. Grace witnessed it all, her heart breaking. She knew their love was facing not just opposition, but the vile schemes of greed and selfishness. But instead of losing hope, she grew more determined. I won't let them hurt you. The truth will come out, sooner or later. Just as their love was being battered by the storm of public opinion, something unexpected happened. An event that no one could have foreseen, not even Frank. One afternoon, as he was sitting on his porch, his tired eyes gazing into the distance, a strange figure appeared at the gate. It was a man in his 40s, tall and thin. His face weathered, his eyes holding a lifetime of experience. Frank flinched, his heart beginning to pound as the man's eyes met his. Dad, the man called out, his voice choked with emotion. Frank froze, his breath catching in his throat. For more than 20 years, he thought he would never hear that word again. It was Samuel, his son, who had run away, leaving him in a long and lonely vigil. Frank shot to his feet, his hands trembling, his voice breaking. Sam? Is that you? The man fell to his knees, hugging his father's legs, tears streaming down his face. I'm sorry, Dad. For all these years, I've drifted everywhere. I've tasted every bitterness. I was wrong, so wrong. But I could never forget you. I didn't come back to ask for forgiveness. I came back to give you back a piece of the truth. Grace happened to be there, stunned as she witnessed the father-son reunion. She quietly backed away, giving them their space. In the small room, once he had calmed down, Samuel began his story. That year, ashamed of his family's poverty and driven by youthful recklessness, he had left. He had worked odd jobs everywhere, but was eventually pulled into the treacherous world of business. He had partnered with dishonest men, been used, betrayed, and finally, left with nothing. Dad, Samuel choked out. All those years, I always wondered how you were. I know I was a terrible son for leaving you alone, but today, when I heard that people were slandering you, I couldn't stand it anymore. I had to come back to tell the truth. Frank clutched his son's hand, tears falling into the deep wrinkles on his face. Just having you back is enough. All the mistakes are in the past. You're alive, you're here. That's all the happiness I need. But Samuel didn't stop there. He continued, saying something that left Grace speechless. I know who started the rumors to slander you. It's not just a few people in the Hayes family. It's the work of some of their business partners. They're afraid that if you and Grace truly get together, the old debt of gratitude will be brought to light, and their own interests will be threatened. Grace was stunned. So it wasn't just greed within the family, but outside forces at play as well. The lies weren't just idle gossip. They were part of a conspiracy to protect financial interests. Frank grew pensive, a rare hardness in his eyes. Well then, son, we can't be silent any longer. We have to tell everyone the truth. Grace stepped forward, placing a hand on Frank's shoulder, her voice clear. Frank, Sam and I will stand with you. I believe that once the truth is revealed, those wicked people will have nowhere left to hide. In that moment, the three of them, an old miner, a prodigal son returned, and a wealthy young heiress were bound together by a single goal: to protect love, to protect the truth, and to restore justice for what was right. After his son Samuel returned, the story began to turn in a new direction. One evening, Grace decided to bring Frank and Samuel to meet her parents. She believed that only when the entire truth was revealed could her family face it head-on. In the vast living room, a heavy atmosphere hung in the air. Preston sat silently, his eyes dark, while Helen fidgeted nervously. Samuel was the first to speak. He knelt and bowed his head. Mr. Hayes, I am Frank's son. I have not returned today to ask for anything, but to speak the truth. Preston was surprised but maintained his composure. Samuel took a deep breath and recounted everything he knew. He spoke of the day the mine collapsed, how Frank had risked his life to save Preston. He spoke of the early days when the Hayes family was still poor, and how Frank had quietly helped them many times. "If it weren't for my father," Samuel said, his voice thick with emotion, "perhaps you would not be here today to have built this empire. But in the name of success, people have forgotten everything, even allowing the world to slander my father." His words silenced the room. Helen trembled, tears falling down her cheeks. Preston closed his eyes, his hands tightening into fists. In his heart, Samuel's every word was a wake-up call. He knew he owed Frank his life, an enormous debt, but for years, he had deliberately buried the truth, afraid that admitting it would shake the very status he had worked so hard to build. Grace moved to her father's side and knelt. Her voice choked. "Dad, Frank is not only the man I love, he is our family's savior. How can you deny it? How can you let people slander a man like that? If you truly value honor, please, look back at the debt you owe." The room was quiet, only the sound of the wind whistling through a crack in the door. All eyes were on Preston. He opened his, looking at Frank, the old man with silver hair, his kind eyes holding a lifetime of experience. Suddenly, the memory of that day rushed back. The strong hand that had pulled him from the rocks, the raspy voice that had calmed him in the face of death. Finally, Preston sighed, his voice low and trembling for the first time. "Yes, I owe Frank my life. If it weren't for him, I would have died in that mine. I know I was wrong to forget my gratitude, to let people humiliate him. But I still cannot accept this relationship between Grace and him." The confession made Helen sob. Grace looked at her father, her heart in turmoil. She knew her father had taken a huge step by admitting the debt, but for him to truly accept her love for Frank, the road ahead was still long and difficult. Ever since the truth about the debt between Frank and Preston was revealed, public opinion began to soften. Many people started to see the story in a different light. But within the Hayes clan, the storm had not yet passed. The clearer the truth became, the more certain people worried that their own interests and status would be affected. The most worried of all was Harrison, Preston's younger brother. Not stopping at malicious rumors, Harrison secretly conspired with outside partners to continue spreading slander. He even hired men to pose as miners, inventing stories that Frank had embezzled funds and had once caused a fatal accident in the mines. But this time, things were not so easy. Since his return, Samuel was determined to stand by his father. He quietly investigated, following the clues. With the street smarts he'd gained from his hard life, Sam quickly uncovered the trail of the person behind it all. Every lead pointed to his uncle, Harrison. At a family meeting, Samuel made a surprise appearance, bringing with him concrete evidence, contracts for hiring rumormongers, records of illicit payments, and even the confessions of some of the hired men. In front of the entire family, Harrison was aghast, his face ashen. "Do you have anything to say for yourself?" Preston's cold voice rang out, his eyes fixed on his younger brother. Harrison stammered, then abruptly fell to his knees, his voice trembling. "Brother, I was only afraid for the family's honor. I only did it for the good of the Hayes name." But no one believed his pathetic excuses anymore. Preston slammed his fist on the table, his voice filled with rage. "For your own greed and personal gain, you slandered the man who saved my life. And you slandered my daughter. You are no longer worthy of the Hayes name." The decision was made on the spot. Harrison was removed from the company's board of directors, stripped of all his benefits, and his honor within the clan was revoked. It was a fitting punishment for the vile schemes he had orchestrated. After Harrison was exposed and punished, the atmosphere in the Hayes clan felt as if a great storm had passed. Many who had previously been fiercely opposed now began to see the story in a different light. They no longer saw an old miner, but a shining example of integrity, courage, and sacrifice. Surprisingly, some of the workers who had been Frank's colleagues also came forward voluntarily. They testified that Frank had saved countless co-workers from accidents in the mines, that he was a man who was always ready to help others, no matter how hard his own life was. At the next family meeting, the atmosphere was much calmer. Helen was the first to speak. "We can object because of age, because of status, but we cannot deny the truth. If it weren't for Frank, this family would not be where it is today. And now, my daughter has found happiness by his side. What reason do we have left to forbid it?" Finally, all eyes turned to Preston. the man with the deciding vote. He sat in silence for a long time. A fierce battle raged within him between his stubborn pride and the undeniable truth. At last, Preston sighed, his voice slow but clear. Perhaps I have been too obstinate. Love cannot be measured by age or status. If Grace has chosen, and if the old debt must be repaid, then I agree. The room fell silent, then erupted. Grace burst into tears and ran to hug her father. Dad, thank you. Helen also cried, taking her husband's hand as if a weight of many years had finally been lifted. Frank sat quietly, his eyes red, his heart trembling. He had never thought this day would come. From then on, the atmosphere in the Hayes family changed dramatically. The objections quieted. Some were still a bit hesitant, but no one dared to openly stand in their way anymore. They understood that the truth was too clear, and Grace had proven with her whole heart that this love was sincere. Outside, the public gossip also died down. When the rumors were debunked, people's attitudes shifted from scorn to curiosity, and then to admiration. Perhaps that's what true love is. Some whispered to each other. Not everyone has the courage to overcome barriers like that. Grace held Frank's hand one sunset evening. She smiled, her eyes shimmering. Frank, we've made it this far. I believe that ahead of us is a wedding. It may be simple, but it will be full of happiness. Frank looked at her, his calloused hand trembling slightly, and then he smiled. For the first time in years, he felt he truly belonged somewhere, a place with love, with family, with a late but well-deserved happiness. The wedding day arrived. It wasn't held in a lavish hotel or a gilded ballroom like other wealthy weddings. Grace had insisted on holding it right in the courtyard of the miners' housing complex, the place that had been part of Frank's whole life, and the place where their love story had begun. At first, many in the family objected, saying it was too simple, unworthy of Grace's status. But in the end, looking into his daughter's eyes, Preston had agreed. That day, the sky over Blackwood was a rare, brilliant blue. The courtyard was cleaned, decorated with balloons and fresh flowers. Long wooden tables were arranged neatly, covered in simple but clean white cloths. The miners, Frank's lifelong colleagues, all dressed in their Sunday best, their faces beaming with joy. When the bride, Grace, appeared in a simple but elegant white dress, the entire space seemed to light up. Her smile was pure, her eyes shining with happiness. And the groom, Frank, wore a simple but neat suit. His silver hair and weathered face seemed to grow younger as he took Grace's hand and stepped onto the makeshift altar. In the front row, Helen's eyes filled with tears. She had never thought her daughter would choose such a difficult path, but seeing Grace hold that man's hand with such a radiant smile, she knew her daughter had found true happiness. Preston sat beside her, his expression serious, but his eyes held a deep emotion. The wedding had no fleet of luxury cars, no extravagant feast, but laughter echoed through the courtyard. The miners sang together, blessing the couple. During the ceremony, Samuel, Frank's son, made a surprise appearance on the stage. He took the microphone, his voice choked with emotion. Today, on behalf of my family, I want to thank everyone for coming to celebrate with us. I also want to say I'm sorry to my father, for all the years I was gone, for leaving him to suffer alone. From this day on, I promise to stay, to be with my father and with Grace, and to build a real family. The courtyard erupted in applause. Frank, unable to hold back his emotions, hugged his son tightly, his vision blurred with happy tears. Grace stood beside them, smiling radiantly, her own eyes shimmering. She felt that not only had her love been rewarded, but a family was slowly being mended. In the evening, under the yellow lights strung across the courtyard, joyful music played. Grace and Frank danced together. Their movements may have been clumsy, but the way they looked at each other was full of love. They were surrounded by applause and cheers. People no longer saw the age gap, no longer distinguished between rich and poor. They saw only a true love that had conquered all prejudice. The wedding ended in joy. No one was drunk on wine, only on the warmth of human connection. The Hayes family looked at each other with a sense of relief. They knew that today was not just the day Grace and Frank were married. It was the day they had all learned a great lesson. Money and status can bring power, but only love and integrity can bring true happiness. Grace leaned her head on Frank's shoulder and whispered, "Frank, from now on, we don't have to be afraid of anything. I believe this life can still give us complete happiness." Frank smiled, his hand tightening around Grace's small one. In his heart, A warm fire was burning. The fire of love, of faith, of a late but eternal happiness. Thank you all for listening. We'd love to hear your thoughts. So please leave a comment below. Your support means the world to us.